Hello everyone, my name is Lusty. I hope everyone is doing well. Today I wanted to talk about a topic which is pretty relevant for my channel actually. You know, on this channel I've played so many different games, but I've especially played a lot of horror games, and I can tell you that it actually hasn't always been that easy to do so. Because the problem the gaming industry has is the same that the movie industry has when it comes to horror. A big majority of it is just trash. Now this raises some questions. When did good horror games stop coming out, and when did they start coming out actually? Now if you ask me, we would probably have to go all the way back to 2008, because I think this year was an important milestone in the horror genre in the gaming industry, because it marked the release of Dead Space. Now here's the thing, Dead Space was a big thing when it came out. It was a shocker to everyone who was a gamer. Now to this day it is still praised by many as one of the scariest horror games of all time. And there's many reasons why that is, because Dead Space was completely different than anything before. It started not with only scary visuals, but that game was packed with intelligent and really spooky audio design as well. And it wasn't too long after that gaming on YouTube became famous as well. To be more specific, horror games on YouTube started becoming really famous in 2009, where people started to just film themselves recording audio while they were playing, or even using face cams to record their own reactions. And nowadays, you know, we just barely have any good horror games anymore. There was a shift to different type of games in the industry, because I think it was a liability for companies if their horror game, which usually were filling up a niche, were not selling so good. So I think in the past few years there was definitely a neglection of horror games, and that also probably marks the time where really bad horror games started coming out in mass. But to give you some sort of overview, let's go along the timeline to see what good games had been coming up over the years and where we are now. So as I said, 2008 was pretty much Dead Space. It really was a milestone, and it was huge, it was well received, it was a great game in any aspect. And then we got Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It's another milestone because it's considered to be one of the first and best indie horror games of all time. I think it majorly became famous through YouTube and Let's Players playing it, but either way it's just another great game in the horror genre. If you just go into the next year, we had Dead Space 2, which was also super great. There was no loss in quality in comparison to the first one. It was great, the horror that the people wanted and they got with this game. And only 2 years later, we had several great games within 1 year. 2013, we had the Cry of Fear game, which was a mod and which became a classic. We had Outlast, a really famous game and a really good and shocking one as well. We had Slender: The Arrival, and we had Dead Space 3 already. Now here's to say that Dead Space 3 wasn't as good as Dead Space 2 and 1, but nonetheless it was a huge AAA horror game and still loved by many people back then. And the last great game I can remember playing and coming out was actually in 2015, and this was also released by the makers of Amnesia, a game called Soma, which is another example of an absolute great indie horror game, and it received so many good critics as well. Now obviously, since this was from the Frictional Games, the makers of Amnesia, they obviously knew how to shock people and what the recipe to good horror is. And just by looking at this timeline, you can see that many great horror games were actually made by only a few studios. Now if we look at this, it tells me actually one thing, that making horror games is not that easy as it seems. And if we talk about nowadays, it's so freaking hard to find some actual good story-driven horror games. Now as you can probably imagine, this made making horror games for YouTube also very hard nowadays, because I personally was struggling so much to find good games that I could make gameplays of and playthroughs and put on YouTube, because there was nothing new out there besides all the old games from years ago that we already had seen on YouTube through playthroughs or by playing myself. If you go through my uploads, you will see that I played a lot of different demos as well, and that was simply because of this, because of the fact that I didn't really know what to play. If you didn't know, there's a website which is called itch.io, and which is also for game developers to upload their demos and short games especially, and who, if anything at all, charge really less for their game, and most of the time it's optional. And I was going through itch.io's horror section day in and day out for many hours just searching for a game to make a video of. because it was so freaking hard to find anything. And if I found something good, it turned out to be a demo only, meaning it was very short and only could fill up one video, or it was supposed to be an actual game but that barely had any story and that you could finish in literally 15, and the longest I've ever played like probably 40 minutes. But most of the time it was really between 10 and 20 minutes, and that also, if anything at all, makes one video a day with one game. So basically the next day what I would have to do was exactly the same process. There's just nothing to look out for if you're a real horror game fan in today's time. You can just check this by yourself. If you filter all the games on Steam by horror games, you will realize that many games even look the same today. Most of the horror games that are developed and released now are done by only one person most of the time, and that's just insane. Also, if you look at the amount of horror games that are being released, and that are usually just short games with barely any story, same mechanics, the same process basically. There's like a creepy house, you're finding notes basically, if anything at all, also solving puzzles, and after 20 to 30 minutes that's basically it. You paid for a game that barely had any content and you finished in record time. And that's the problem. Since there's no AAA horror games anymore, single developers or really small developer groups consisting of 1, 2 or maximum 3 developers are putting out these games that are filled with assets from either, depending on the engine they use, the Unity store or just the Unreal Engine store. And if so many people make so many horror games and access the same stores, of course at some point you will realize and wonder why the different games that you're playing look all the same. There's no creativity put in those games anymore, and they just all follow the same scheme, and that's what makes it so incredibly frustrating, and it has for so many years now that I'm just so bored with it. Sometimes even when I was surfing the Steam store, I realized that there was a bunch of games who looked so alike that I was wondering how this is possible. And even one time I realized that in the reviews of one game, there was another developer who left his own review regarding that game, stating that the game is just a copy, just a ripoff from his own game. So imagine you're a single developer, what makes it even harder. Even though you have all the assets from these stores that you can access, it still takes hundreds if not thousands of hours to put out the game and put it on Steam to be able to sell. And another guy just decides to copy all of your stuff, change some textures, if he's not too lazy, also some objects. And this dev I was talking about even put out a comparison video that he had linked to his review and that I had watched, and it was so crazy to see how audacious people are to just copy a whole game and sell it as their own on Steam. And I don't even know, if you asked me, if Steam does anything against it. They might do something against it, but when I was checking it out, it was an ongoing thing. So it's literally safe to say that the horror genre is practically dead right now. It has reached the point where developers are copying other developers' games and selling them on Steam, on itch.io, or selling short or medium length games filled with assets, nothing done by their own, in an attempt to have a quick cash grab. And that was basically the motivation behind all these games, and especially the horror genre like no other. Everyone's trying their luck for an easy cash grab and ripping people off. But despite all this, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, because we know that a Dead Space remake is on their way, which is supposed to be a really proper remake, and which looks so promising because they also asked the community what they want to see, and they even made changes depending on community feedback. And I really can't wait for the Dead Space remake coming out in a year. With the Callisto Protocol, we have another AAA game coming up this year. It's initiated and developed by the guy who made the Dead Space games as well. And just the trailers I've seen, the game looks insanely scary, and I think it's gonna be some Dead Space caliber game. Thank God we're close to having 2 great AAA horror games released again. And I really hope that these 2 games are actually good and sell well, so that other smaller studios also see that making horror games is still worth it and that they should try their luck. Because there's just nothing better to play a really scary and good horror game at night with the lights out. I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you did, give it a like, drop a comment and favorize. And as always, I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.